The familiar clatter of dropped silverware was a common prelude to Lady Emma Fairfax's approach at Cloverbrook's dinner table. A collective bracing of shoulders signalled her imminent arrival. Today, however, the casualty transcended a mere fork. A crystal carafe of elderflower cordial met the polished oak with a surprisingly violent crack, its fragments scattering like shattered sunlight across the pristine tablecloth. A collective gasp rippled through the gathered ladies, quickly stifled into polite murmurs. Emma stood amidst the shimmering puddles and glittering shards, a lone scarlet rose, the intended centrepiece, wilting in her trembling hand. "Oh, Emma, darling," Lady Pemberton purred, her voice a silken sheath over barely veiled amusement. "What a spirited entrance." Emma's cheeks flamed. Spirited, a diplomat's word for disaster, clumsy, awkward, a walking catastrophe. These were the more common, whispered judgments that followed her like a persistent shadow through every drawing-room in London. She offered a fragile smile, her gaze flitting to the footman, already advancing with broom and dustpan. Her hands, still clutching the mangled blossom, felt monstrously large and utterly useless. 23 years old, the niece of the respectable Duke of Blackwood, and yet she could scarcely navigate a simple dinner party without causing some manner of destruction. "Please do forgive me," Emma murmured, her voice barely audible above the resumed chatter. She set down the ruined rose and retreated from the table, cheeks burning, eyes stinging with unshed tears. She refused to let fall. Not here, not in front of them. Later, in the solace of the sun-drenched conservatory, Emma sought refuge in the intricate dance of needle and thread. Embroidery was her quiet triumph, a realm where her habitually clumsy hands found a peculiar grace. The silk floss moved smoothly through the linen, creating delicate rosebuds and twining vines with a precision that never manifested in her daily movements. Yet the humiliation of the morning clung to her, persistent as the scent of spilled cordial that seemed to have seeped into her very skin. A shadow fell across her work. She glanced up to find Lord Ashford, a distant cousin whose kindness was as constant as his hopeless flirtations were fumbling. His usually jovial face now bore an uncharacteristic gravity. "Emma," he began, his voice hushed and strangely urgent. "I heard about the incident." She winced. "Hardly an incident, Lord Ashford. Merely another testament to my inherent ineptitude." He shook his head, stepping closer. No, not that. I meant the letter." He extended a crisp, cream-coloured envelope, sealed with an unfamiliar crest whose stark, almost brutal elegance sent an inexplicable shiver down her spine. The paper felt weighted with significance, heavier than mere correspondence had any right to be. A letter? For me? Emma's brow furrowed as she accepted it with hesitant fingers. Personal correspondence outside of inevitable invitations and terse notes from her uncle was a rarity. "It's from the Duke of Ashworth," Lord Ashford said, his eyes wide with a blend of awe and apprehension. "He requests your presence at Ashworth Hall for an extended visit." Her embroidery needle clattered onto the polished stone floor. The Duke of Ashworth. The name alone conjured an imposing landscape of stark northern cliffs and ancient stone fortresses, presided over by a man whose reputation was as dark and formidable as the tales whispered about him. Alexander Thorne, the Duke of Ashworth, known throughout society as the Ruthless Duke, a man who acquired his desires with unyielding will, whose disdain for social niceties was legendary, whose cold rejection had sent more than one hopeful debutante fleeing London in tears. For him to request her presence was inconceivable. "Me? The Duke of Ashworth?" she stammered, retrieving her needle with a trembling hand. "There must be some mistake. He doesn't even know me. I've never been introduced to him." Lord Ashford's expression grew more troubled. Apparently, he does now. The letter is quite explicit. He desires your company at Ashworth Hall, immediately. He paused, then added, his voice barely a whisper, "And when the Duke of Ashworth desires something, Emma, he invariably gets it." With shaking fingers, Emma broke the seal and unfolded the thick parchment. The handwriting was bold and decisive, each letter formed with deliberate precision. "Miss Emma Fairfax, your presence is required at Ashworth Hall. A carriage will be sent for you 3 days hence. I expect you will accept this invitation. Ashworth, no pleasantries, no explanation, simply a command dressed in the thinnest veneer of civility." The afternoon sun, typically a balm to her troubled spirits, now felt strangely oppressive. Emma looked from the letter in her hand to her unfinished tapestry, a scene depicting a graceful huntress, her bow drawn with elegant precision. A stark counterpoint to the woman now holding the Duke's decree, her future suddenly as uncertain and fragmented as the broken pieces of the elderflower carafe. "What does he want with me?" she whispered. Lord Ashford could only shake his head, his face pale. "I cannot fathom it. But Emma, be careful. The Duke of Ashworth is not a man of gentle affections." Her maid, Agnes, discovered her an hour later, still clutching the letter, staring blankly at the tapestry as the sun dipped toward the horizon. "My lady, are you quite well? You look as though you've seen a spectre." Emma slowly turned, her eyes wide with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Part fear, part something else entirely. Something that made her pulse quicken and her breath catch. "Worse, Agnes," she replied softly. "I've glimpsed my future." 3 days later, Emma found herself in an elegant black carriage bearing the Ashworth crest, rattling northward toward a destiny she neither understood nor felt prepared to face. Her uncle, Duke Alistair Blackwood, had been surprisingly accommodating about her departure, though his expression had been unreadable when she'd shown him the letter. "The Duke of Ashworth is not a man to refuse," was all he'd said, his weathered fingers tracing the bold signature. "Go, Emma. And remember, you are a Fairfax. Whatever game he's playing, you have more strength than you credit yourself." Now, watching the rolling countryside give way to wilder terrain, Emma wondered if her uncle's confidence was misplaced. What strength could possibly prepare her for Alexander Thorne? Ashworth Hall rose before her like something from a Gothic novel, all dark stone and severe architecture, perched on a wind-swept cliff overlooking a churning sea. No welcoming gardens softened its edges, no gentle terraces invited leisurely strolls. It was a fortress, and it looked every bit as forbidding as its master's reputation. A stern-faced butler escorted her through echoing corridors to a suite of rooms that, while luxuriously appointed, felt more like a gilded cage than a guest chamber. She was informed that His Grace would receive her at dinner. Until then, she was to rest and refresh herself. Rest proved impossible. Emma paced the Persian carpet, her mind spinning with questions that had no answers. Why had he summoned her? What did he want? And more troublingly, why had she come? When Agnes helped her dress for dinner, Emma chose her finest gown, a pale silk in dove grey with delicate silver embroidery. If she was to meet the ruthless Duke, she would at least look the part of a lady, even if her hands trembled as she fastened her pearl earrings. The butler came for her precisely at 8 and led her through a labyrinth of corridors to a formal dining room that could have seated 50 but was set for only 2. At the far end, before a roaring fire, stood a man who could only be Alexander Thorne, Duke of Ashworth. He was younger than she'd imagined, perhaps 30, and devastatingly handsome in a way that seemed almost cruel. Dark hair swept back from a high forehead, strong features carved with aristocratic precision, and eyes the colour of storm-tossed seas that fixed on her with an intensity that stole her breath. He was tall, imposingly so, dressed in impeccable evening black that seemed to drink in the firelight. Everything about him spoke of controlled power, of a predator at ease in his domain. Miss Fairfax. His voice was a low rumble, resonant and commanding. Welcome to Ashworth Hall. Emma sank into a curtsy, grateful for the years of training that allowed her body to perform the movement even as her mind reeled. Your Grace, thank you for your invitation. A slight curve touched his lips, not quite a smile, more the ghost of amusement. Invitation? He repeated, as if tasting the word. Is that what we're calling it? He moved toward her with fluid grace, and Emma forced herself not to step back. He stopped perhaps 3 feet away, close enough that she could smell the faint scent of sandalwood and something subtly metallic, like winter air or honed steel. You're wondering why you're here, he stated, not asked. The thought had crossed my mind, Your Grace. Because I wanted you here. He said it as if it were the most natural explanation in the world. Come, let us dine, and I will explain. He offered his arm. Emma hesitated only a moment before placing her hand on his sleeve, feeling the solid muscle beneath the fine wool. He led her to the table, seated her with unexpected courtesy, and took his own place at the head, close enough to converse, but still maintaining the physical separation of rank and formality. The meal was exquisite, course after course of perfectly prepared dishes that Emma barely tasted. The Duke ate sparingly, his attention never wavering from her face. It was unnerving, that steady regard, as if he were studying a particularly interesting specimen. You're frightened of me, he observed as the soup was cleared. Should I not be? Emma met his gaze, finding some reserve of courage she hadn't known she possessed. Your reputation precedes you, Your Grace. Does it? He leaned back in his chair, wineglass held loosely in long fingers. And what does my reputation tell you? That you are ruthless, unforgiving, that you crush anyone who crosses you and care nothing for society's opinions. She paused. That you have no interest in marriage or courtship, yet you've summoned an unmarried woman to your home with no chaperone but my maid. My reputation will be in tatters. Your reputation, he said quietly, was already in tatters. London's Laughingstock, they call you. The clumsy niece of Blackwood, too awkward to catch a husband, too gauche to navigate a simple dinner party. The words, though softly spoken, hit like blows. Emma's cheeks flamed, but she refused to look away. If you brought me here to humiliate me, Your Grace, you needn't have bothered. Society manages that quite well on its own. I brought you here, he said, setting down his glass with deliberate precision, because I have been watching you, Emma Fairfax. For months, and I've seen something that all of London's simpering fools have missed. Emma's heart hammered against her ribs. And what is that? His eyes locked with hers, and in them she saw something that made her breath catch, an intensity that was almost frightening in its focus. Strength, he said simply. Resilience. You endure their mockery with grace. You hold your head high when lesser women would have fled to the country in shame. You possess something rare, Miss Fairfax. Genuine courage masquerading as vulnerability. She stared at him, unable to form words. No one had ever spoken to her thus. No one had ever looked beneath the surface of her social failures to see... What? She wasn't even certain what he claimed to see. I still don't understand why I'm here, she managed. The Duke rose from his seat and moved to stand beside her. She had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. He reached down and took her chin gently between his fingers, tilting her face up to the firelight. You're here, Miss Fairfax, because I have decided you will be my wife." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Your wife?" The words came out as barely a whisper. "Yes." He released her chin but didn't step back. "I have no interest in simpering debutantes or calculating mammas. I want a woman of substance, and you, Emma Fairfax, have been forged in a crucible that would have broken most of your peers. You will make an excellent Duchess of Ashworth." Emma shot to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You cannot be serious. You don't know me. I don't know you. You cannot simply decide such a thing." "I can, and I have." His voice remained maddeningly calm. "The question is whether you will accept." "And if I refuse?" A shadow passed across his features, something dark and possessive that made her shiver. "Then you return to London, to your life of social ridicule and gradual relegation to spinster aunt, to watching your peers marry and have families while you grow old embroidering in your uncle's conservatory." He paused. "Or you accept my offer and become one of the most powerful women in England. You would want for nothing. You would command respect instead of mockery, and you would be under my protection. No one would dare speak against you again." It was a devil's bargain, presented with brutal honesty. Emma's mind raced. He was right about her prospects. They were nil. No gentleman would offer for a woman known as society's favourite object of ridicule. She faced decades of precisely the lonely future he'd described. But marriage to this man? This cold, commanding stranger who looked at her as if she were a problem to be solved, a possession to be acquired? "Why me?" she asked again, desperate to understand. "Truly, Your Grace." There must be dozens of women who would accept such an offer. For the first time, something shifted in his expression, a crack in that impenetrable facade. When he spoke, his voice was lower, rougher. "Because when I look at you, Emma Fairfax, I see something I have never seen before. Something that makes me want to know every thought in your head, every dream you've hidden away, every fear you've conquered." His hand rose as if to touch her face, then fell back to his side. "You are my obsession, and I am not a man who denies himself what he desires." The raw honesty in those words was more frightening than any threat could have been. This was no business arrangement, no cold calculation. This was something far more dangerous, a fixation, an intensity that burned like dark fire in his eyes. "I need time," Emma heard herself say, "to think, to decide." "You have 3 days." He stepped back, releasing her from the weight of his presence. "Explore the house, the grounds. Consider your options. But know this, Miss Fairfax, when you give me your answer, it will be binding. I am not a man who accepts refusal gracefully." It was both promise and warning, wrapped in velvet courtesy. Emma fled. The following days at Ashworth Hall passed in a strange, dreamlike haze. The Duke gave her space, appearing only at dinner, where they engaged in conversations that ranged from surprisingly mundane topics, the management of large estates, the politics of Parliament, to deeply personal questions that left Emma feeling exposed and oddly exhilarated. He asked about her childhood, her relationship with her uncle, her love of embroidery. He listened with complete attention when she spoke, as if every word mattered, as if she were the most fascinating creature he'd ever encountered. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. On the second day, he found her in the library, a magnificent room lined floor to ceiling with books. She was standing before a window overlooking the wild sea, a volume of Shakespeare loose in her hands. "You haven't been reading," he observed, moving to stand beside her. "No," she admitted. "I've been thinking about my proposal, about many things." She turned to face him. May I ask you something honestly, Your Grace? Alexander, he corrected. If you're considering becoming my wife, you should use my name. Alexander. She tested the name, found it suited him. Why has a man of your position never married? You're wealthy, titled, still young. You must have had opportunities. A muscle ticked in his jaw. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer, but then he spoke, his gaze fixed on the churning waves beyond the window. Because I refuse to play society's games. The marriage mart is a marketplace where women are commodities and men are purses. I have no interest in a wife chosen for her connections or her bloodline, who will spend my money and bear my heirs while maintaining a separate life filled with gossip and intrigue. He turned to her. I want something real, Emma. Something honest. I believe you can give me that. But you barely know me. I know enough. I know you face cruelty with dignity. I know your hands create beauty even when society sees only your mishaps. I know you are intelligent. Your uncle's letters to you discuss philosophy and current affairs, not fashion and gossip. I know you are brave enough to come here, despite every instinct screaming that you shouldn't. His voice dropped. And I know that when I look at you, I feel something I've never felt before. Call it obsession, call it fascination. I call it fate. Emma's breath caught. How did one respond to such declarations? They seemed pulled from the pages of a novel, yet the intensity in his storm-grey eyes was undeniably real. You speak of honesty, she said carefully, yet you've orchestrated this entire situation to give me little choice but to accept. Is that honest? A slow smile curved his lips, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his face, softening the harsh lines, revealing unexpected warmth. Ruthlessly honest, he agreed. I told you, I get what I want. And I want you, Emma Fairfax. But the choice is still yours. I won't force you into anything. If you truly cannot accept this, I will return you to London with your reputation intact. I'll spread word that you came as my late mother's goddaughter, that the invitation was merely to honour an old connection. He stepped closer. But I hope you'll stay. She should refuse. Every rational thought told her this was madness, and yet... When had anyone ever looked at her the way Alexander Thorne did? When had anyone ever seen past her clumsy exterior to the woman beneath? When had anyone ever wanted her? Not despite her flaws, but because of the strength she developed in surviving them? I need more time, she whispered. Then take it. He reached out, tucked a stray curl behind her ear with surprising gentleness. But know that my patience, while considerable, is not infinite. On the third evening, Emma stood before her mirror in the dove-grey gown, her hair arranged in soft curls by Agnes's skilled hands. Tonight she would give the Duke her answer. She'd spent the day walking the cliff paths, letting the wild wind tear at her clothes and hair, seeking clarity in the savage beauty of the northern coast. And somewhere between the grey sea and the greyer sky, she'd found her answer. The Duke was waiting for her in the drawing room rather than the formal dining room, a smaller, more intimate space. He stood as she entered, his eyes searching her face. You've decided, he said. It wasn't a question. I have. Emma moved to stand before him, drawing on every ounce of courage she possessed. But I have conditions. One dark eyebrow rose. Conditions? Yes. If I am to be your wife, I will not be merely a decorative duchess who smiles and produces heirs. I want a true partnership. I want to be involved in estate management, in decisions that affect our household. I want your respect, not just your protection. Done, he said immediately. I want fidelity. No mistresses, no casual affairs. If we are to be married, We will be faithful to each other. I wouldn't have it any other way. And I want time. Time to learn to know you before the wedding night. Time to grow accustomed to this. Something flickered in his expression. Understanding, perhaps, or approval. You shall have it. We'll have a long betrothal if you wish. I told you, Emma. I'm not looking for a decorative wife. I want a true partner. Everything you've asked for is exactly what I hoped you would demand. Emma took a shaky breath. Then yes, Alexander Thorne. I will marry you. The change in him was immediate and profound. The careful control dropped away, replaced by something fierce and possessive. He pulled her into his arms, and for a heartbeat she thought he might kiss her. Instead, he pressed his forehead to hers, eyes closed, breathing her in. Thank you, he whispered, and the raw emotion in his voice undid her. This powerful, ruthless man was thanking her, as if she'd given him something precious beyond measure. Perhaps she had. When shall we marry? She asked, her hands resting uncertainly on his chest. Soon. He pulled back enough to meet her eyes. But first, we must face London together. I want to make it clear to every person who ever mocked you that you are under my protection, that you are mine, and that anyone who dares speak against you will answer to me. A thrill of something, fear, excitement, ran through her. That sounds rather intimidating. His smile was dark and promising. Good. Let them be intimidated. Let them learn what it means to cross Alexander Thorne. And more importantly, let them learn what it means to cross the future Duchess of Ashworth. A week later, Emma found herself back in London, but everything had changed. She stayed not at her uncle's townhouse, but at Ashworth House, the Duke's imposing residence in Mayfair. Agnes had been supplemented by an entire staff of servants who treated Emma with the deference due a duchess, and Alexander had insisted on outfitting her with a completely new wardrobe. You will look every inch the duchess you're about to become, he'd said, overriding her protests. No more fading into the background. No more drab colours meant to avoid attention. Now, standing before her mirror in a gown of deep sapphire silk that made her pale skin glow and her dark hair shine, Emma barely recognised herself. The woman looking back at her was elegant, even beautiful, confident. You look perfect, Alexander said from the doorway, making her jump. He'd developed a habit of appearing without warning, moving through his houses with a predator's silence. I look like someone playing dress-up, Emma countered, but there was no heat in it. He crossed to her, standing behind her so they both faced the mirror. His hands came to rest on her shoulders, and Emma fought not to lean back into his solid warmth. You look like the Duchess of Ashworth, he corrected. Are you ready for tonight? Tonight. The Peton Ball, one of the season's most important events. The first time Emma would appear in public since arriving in London, and the first time she would appear on Alexander Thorne's arm. I'm terrified, she admitted. His hands tightened on her shoulders. Good. Use that. Channel it. They will whisper and stare and try to understand what's happening. Let them wonder. Let them see how little their opinions matter to you now. Easy to say when you're not the one they've been mocking for years. He turned her to face him, his expression fierce. They mocked you because you were vulnerable. You're not vulnerable anymore, Emma. You're mine, and I protect what's mine. The Pemberton ballroom pulsed with the usual nervous energy of the ton at its finest, a symphony of hushed conversations and rustling silk beneath the orchestra's elegant strains. Emma stood at Alexander's side in the entrance, her hand resting lightly on his arm, and felt every eye in the room turn to them. The whispers started immediately. She could almost hear them, even over the music. Is that Emma Fairfax? With the Duke of Ashworth? Impossible. What game is this? Alexander seemed utterly unbothered by the attention. He guided her into the ballroom with the easy confidence of a man who owned every space he entered. His hand covered hers on his arm, warm and reassuring. "Remember," he murmured, low enough that only she could hear, "you are exactly where you belong." Lady Pemberton approached, her expression a mask of confusion and barely concealed delight at the gossip fodder that had just walked into her ball. "Your Grace!" What an unexpected pleasure. And Miss Fairfax, how lovely to see you. Lady Pemberton. Alexander's voice was cool and correct. "Thank you for your hospitality. May I present my fiancée, Miss Emma Fairfax?" The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Fiancée? Lady Pemberton's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Around them, conversation died as word spread through the ballroom like wildfire. Emma felt hundreds of eyes boring into her, felt the weight of their collective shock and disbelief. Her instinct was to shrink, to hide, to apologize for existing. But Alexander's hand tightened over hers, and she lifted her chin instead. "Fiancé," Lady Pemberton finally managed. Congratulations are certainly in order. When? How? ? Recently, Alexander said, offering no further explanation. "Now, if you'll excuse us, I promised my intended the first waltz." He led Emma onto the dance floor as the orchestra, taking their cue, began a waltz. The crowd parted before them like the Red Sea before Moses. Emma was acutely aware that they were the only couple dancing, that every person in the ballroom was watching them. Alexander pulled her into waltz position, his hand warm and solid at her waist. As they began to move, he leaned down to whisper, "Breathe, Emma." She realized she'd been holding her breath and released it in a shaky exhale. "They're all staring." "Let them." His grey eyes held hers, steady and sure. "You're doing beautifully." And somehow, with his hand guiding her, his presence anchoring her, Emma found that she was. Her feet, usually so prone to tangling, followed his lead effortlessly. Her body, typically awkward and uncertain, moved in harmony with his. They were waltzing, and she wasn't stumbling. She wasn't falling. She was flying. Other couples gradually joined them on the floor, but Emma barely noticed. She was lost in the rhythm, in the sensation of Alexander's hands on her, in the heat of his gaze that never left her face. "I want to make something clear," he said as they turned. His voice was pitched for her ears alone, but his expression was intense enough that anyone watching could see the emotion there. "You are not merely under my protection, Emma. You are my chosen partner, my equal, my obsession. Anyone who seeks to hurt you will answer to me." Emma's breath caught at the possessive promise in his words, at the fierce protection blazing in his eyes. When the waltz ended, Alexander didn't immediately release her. Instead, he raised her gloved hand to his lips and kissed it, his eyes holding hers the entire time. It was a small gesture, barely remarkable in itself, but the intensity behind it transformed it into a public claim that left no room for misinterpretation. "There," he murmured, finally releasing her hand. "Now they know." The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Emma was approached by ladies who had never given her the time of day, suddenly eager to congratulate her and express their delight. Gentlemen bowed over her hand with newfound respect. And through it all, Alexander remained at her side, a dark and formidable presence that made it clear she was under his protection. Lady Atherton, who had once called her a wallflower destined to bloom into nothing, approached with a simpering smile. "Miss Fairfax, you must tell me how you captured the Duke's attention." We had all quite given up hope of seeing him married. Before Emma could formulate a response, Alexander's voice cut through the air, cold as winter frost. Miss Fairfax captured my attention, Lady Atherton, by being the most genuine person in a room full of calculated artifice, by possessing more courage and grace in her smallest finger than most of society can claim in their entire persons. His gaze swept over the woman with withering disdain. She captured my attention by being exactly who she is, without pretense or artifice, a lesson many here could benefit from learning. Lady Atherton paled and made a hasty retreat. Emma looked up at Alexander, part shocked, part grateful, and entirely overwhelmed. "That may have been excessive," she whispered. "That," he replied, "was necessary. No one will question your worth again." He was right. As the evening wore on, Emma felt the shift. Where once she'd been an object of ridicule, she was now treated with respect, not for herself perhaps, but for the man at her side. But it was a beginning. As they left the ball, Alexander helped her into his carriage with careful attention. Once the door closed behind them, shutting out the world, he took her hand. "You were magnificent tonight," he said quietly. "I hope you know that." Emma looked down at their joined hands, his large and strong, hers small and delicate within his grasp. A week ago she'd been alone, ridiculed, facing a future of slow decline into irrelevance. Now she was betrothed to one of the most powerful men in England, and the ton that had mocked her now curtsied and fawned. It should have felt like victory, and in many ways it did. But there was also a small voice in her heart that whispered, "Does he care for you? Or do you simply satisfy his obsession?" As if sensing her thoughts, Alexander lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm, his lips warm through her glove. "Thank you," he said again, as he had the night she'd accepted him, "for trusting me, for giving me a chance to prove that obsession can become something more. Something more. Not love, he hadn't claimed that, but something. A beginning, perhaps." Emma squeezed his hand. "Take me home, Alexander." "Home," he repeated and smiled. "Yes, home." And as the carriage rolled through London's gaslit streets toward Ashworth House, Emma Fairfax allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, she'd found exactly that. The ballroom at Ashworth Hall was filled with light and music and laughter. Emma, resplendent in a gown of midnight blue silk, moved through the crowd of guests with easy grace. The awkward, clumsy girl who'd once shattered a crystal carafe was gone, replaced by a confident woman who commanded respect without demanding it. She was speaking with the Duchess of Pemberton when she felt rather than saw Alexander's approach. Even after 6 months of marriage, her body still responded to his presence, her pulse quickening, her awareness sharpening. His hand settled at the small of her back, a gesture of possession and affection that had become familiar. "Your Grace," the Duchess simpered. "What a lovely ball, and the Duchess looks radiant. Marriage clearly agrees with her." "It does indeed," Alexander agreed, his voice warm with unmistakable pride. "If you'll excuse us, Lady Pemberton, I wish to steal my wife for a dance." He led Emma onto the floor, pulling her into his arms with the ease of long practice. They moved together perfectly now, a partnership forged through months of learning each other's rhythms. "Have I told you today how beautiful you are?" he murmured. "Twice at breakfast, once at lunch, and 3 times while I was dressing," Emma replied with a smile. "Then I'm behind schedule." His hand tightened at her waist. "You're beautiful, Emma Thorne, Duchess of Ashworth. Beautiful and brilliant and mine." "Yours," she agreed. "And you are mine." "Always." He leaned down to whisper in her ear. Shall we scandalise our guests by leaving our own ball early?" Emma laughed, the sound bright and unrestrained. "We're the hosts, Alexander. We can't simply abandon our duties. Watch me." And he would have. She knew. He would have swept her away without a care for propriety if she'd agreed. Because that was who Alexander Thorne was, a man who took what he wanted and apologised to no one. But he was also a man who asked her opinion on every estate decision, who listened to her ideas about improving conditions for their tenants, who read poetry to her by the fire and made love to her with a passion that left her breathless. He was obsessed with her still, but that obsession had deepened into something richer and more complex. Love, she thought. This was love, in all its fierce and complicated glory. "After the ball," she promised, "then you may scandalise me to your heart's content." His smile was dark and promising. "I intend to, Your Grace. I very much intend to." And as they danced under the glittering chandeliers, surrounded by the very people who had once mocked her, Emma Fairfax, no, Emma Thorne, Duchess of Ashworth, realised that sometimes the most unexpected obsessions led to the most extraordinary loves. The Duke's obsession had saved her. But perhaps, she thought, as Alexander's arms tightened around her, her love had saved him too. Thank you for watching this story to the end. Like, subscribe and comment where you are watching from.